Hello, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we have a first timer here on the channel. My guest today writes adult fantasy in a world setting that she created. It started with an idea for a novel over a decade ago, and the world has grown over that time. She has enjoyed stories that twist reality, span worlds that aren't our own, and explore characters on epic quests and small moments. She loves games, especially Dungeons and Dragons. And in this interview, we'll be learning about her two books, which are right behind her, to her left or to her right, depending on how you see this on your computer or tablet. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, author Dana Brentson. Dana, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So, before we dive into your background as an author, what can you tell our viewers and listeners about the two books behind you?
So my series starts off with this one, Her Latent Charm, following my main character Lila as she's trying to navigate having magic in a world that doesn't have magic historically. Lots of trials and tribulations, lots of finding herself and gaining control over what's going on with herself. And then the next one in the series continues Lila's journey as she becomes more of a magical powerhouse, kind of taking control of the wild magic that she's got inside of her and fighting an old enemy that shows back up from book one.
Nice. Very nice. So, in your bio, you sent me, you've been working on this story for a very, very long time. It started as an idea, and now you brought it to the forefront in book form. So, what was sort of that aha moment where you wanted to make that transition from idea to a book?
Kind of a cliche idea, but it did come to me in like a dream. Started off as this girl who had amnesia and had to find her way, and that was actually like the first word of the first book. The first draft was the word amnesia. The little
Ooh.
reworking from there, thankfully. But it's most of my ideas kind of come from dreams, probably because I am over inundated in fantasy, alternate reality stuff day in and day out, whether it's a show or a video game or a song or Dungeons and Dragons. It's just all day, every day for me. So a lot of that comes through in dreams and
Nice.
ideas that way.
So, were you always interested in writing and telling stories growing up, or did that come about later in life?
Um, I always liked the ideas of stories, and I've been a big reader for a very long time. Um, but I never really thought that it was something that I could pursue. I wrote a little bit in high school. I wrote some short stories and things, but I never thought that it was something that I wanted to pursue until later. And I just started writing stuff down, and it kind of morphed from there.
Nice. So, let's actually talk about that part. So, when you began transforming this idea into a draft, did you have any goals you set out with this series in the beginning? And if so, what were they? And what was sort of the need you wanted to satisfy for your prospective readers?
When I first started off, it was just writing stuff down. And then as it became an actual novel, like long enough to become a novel, I had that, kind of standard dream that a lot of people have, get the literary agent, find the big book deal, become, a well-known name, like a lot of the people that I had read.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of quickly fell away just because I wasn't as invested at first. And then once I became more invested again, it kind of fell away because I figured out that it's such a subjective business, the book industry.
Yes.
And I had no notion of what it was to be an indie author at that point either. So that kind of just fell away. But then when I picked it back up and I started looking at it again with a little bit more time in between, I feel like, storytelling, Dungeons and Dragons, all that kind of stuff actually made me a better storyteller. and I was able to shape the book into a better way. It came from the naive idea of like, the kind of typical romantasy, falling in love at first sight and all of that, into a
Right.
more mature, grown-up relationship. And I feel like that's something that I'm hoping to find readers that can resonate with that, instead of the instant love and miscommunication and all that kind of stuff that comes with a lot of, mainstream media,
Mm-hmm.
that mainline romantasy and fantasy genre right now. I like the idea of having people who are developing themselves and then also developing themselves in a relationship, so that you can support one another and it's not just all turmoil to get drama. It's finding somebody who's an equal partner who will support you.
Right. So you want to make a mature romance as opposed to the on again, off again romance that is sometimes found in the romance fantasy genre, as well as the spicy romance. You want it to be different from the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, at least in that way.
Awesome. So when you began writing this out, coming back to it again with a new perspective and developing the story and then getting the ARC readers and beta readers, what was the response like from them? And also, when you told your family that you were going back to this story and developing it into a series, what was their reaction like?
Well, beta readers, at my first novel, the first time around, I didn't even know what that was. So diving back into it, I did a lot more research and looking into how to develop my story. And I had a lot of good help from my beta readers. Some of my family are actually very critical. A lot of people say don't use family as beta readers, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm fortunate in having people who will tell me their actual opinion on things. So that helped me bring things along very realistically. My sister Rhiannon actually did that quite a bit, as well as my brother Alex. They're both very critical of the entertainment that they see. So they help me flesh things out, make things more realistic, make conversations more realistic, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then from my family, they were excited that I was writing. They were a little bit confused because it was like kind of a left turn out of nowhere, because I work in the veterinary industry. So it's completely different going into like a creative idea from this other job. A little bit, I would say, excited but also guarded about it.
Mm.
You know, wanted to be excited and encouraging, but at the same time make sure you don't quit your day job, kind of a thing, like most of us do.
Right. Yes, definitely. Almost like that, a balance between, as you said, don't quit your day job where
Mhm.
you are still writing, but you need the income that's going to help finance, the editors, cover artists, and all that stuff. And from the reviews that you've gotten from your beta readers, is there one review that really stands out to you? And looking back, do you feel that their reviews have validated your goals that you set out with, as you mentioned before, in the sense of, telling a good story with great characters that in the romance fantasy genre, but it's not your typical romance fantasy story, because it's also, if I'm not mistaken, high fantasy, correct? It's also high
Yeah.
fantasy, your stories?
Yeah, it's high fantasy in that, it's inundated in that fantasy world. It's not our world with a little extra on top of it. My beta readers definitely helped me to shape things. I think as far as reviews go, I had one ARC review from that's advanced reader copy review from my first book, someone named Tanya, who really resonated with the story I was telling, the whole adult relationship, equal partner thing, not the instant love and kind of, I feel like, lacking in plot sometimes for the sake of spice and romance.
Right.
Um, but resonated with my character's journey and the fact that the world was growing around her, and she was kind of taking her power from herself, and embracing what she has. And that really helped me keep going as everything all of life gets in the way, and you get those moments where you just don't feel like writing, or then you get that imposter syndrome where you're going, is this even something I should do? I looked at that review a lot, actually, and it kept me going because, yeah, this person got it. This person is understanding what I'm trying to do. And that helped me move forward, actually.
I'm actually glad you brought up the topic of imposter syndrome, because it is very, very true. Because writing a book or anything that has to do with anything creative is a very daunting journey. It's long hours, it's years, it's hours and hours of editing and revising. And if you're going the independent path, it's pretty much financing your own marketing team, financing your own editors, and finding a cover artist whose art style matches the story and the overall tone of the book. And that can take a lot. And it's a very intimidating feeling. And I'm sure you'll definitely agree, Dan, that it never really goes away, imposter syndrome. It's always there in the back of every creator's mind. It just waits for that right opportunity. So for you, with all of that, because, as you say, life happens, life sometimes gets in the way, and it's out of our control. So with all of that, what has still disciplined you to continue writing this series, and how do you think it's changed you as a person and an author from when you started?
Well, when I started, I had no idea that any of that was a thing. I just wrote and I wrote, and I kind of, had no idea that so much more went into it. And then I kind of put it down and came back later and realized, okay, all of these revisions are important and you need to keep working on it. And I feel like through all that time, it's made me a better writer. But as far as keeping that imposter syndrome at bay, sometimes it's impossible. But a lot of the time, just brainstorming story ideas, or if I get stuck in a rut, talking about it, whether it's to myself while I'm driving or, listening to music, or my husband has been a really big sounding board for me because sometimes I just talk at him and the ideas kind of morph themselves around that, just getting it out instead of having it twirl in my head. Or sometimes he actually can have a different perspective as somebody who isn't in the middle of all of this story creating. So that's been big, helping me combat that, is actually having a support structure around me, whether it's my husband or whether it's my family or my friends. I've got a couple of good cheerleader friends, or sometimes even the community on Instagram and, Bookstagram, Book Talk, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Sometimes just seeing encouraging information from other writers, whether they meant it to be personally for me or not. I feel like a lot of those voices are very helpful.
Definitely. I'm actually glad you brought up the sense of, like, community and networking, which are very, very important for independent authors, which we'll touch on later. But it's a nice segue now into the business side of being an author. Now, Dan, as you said before, you wanted to go the traditional route in the beginning of, like, finding a publicist, writing the query letters, going through all of that initially. But as time went on, it seemed that the self-publishing path seemed to be the better one for you. And as your stories developed and as you developed as an author, it was the right path to go on. Now, looking back on that, with the knowledge you have now as opposed to that point in your life, would you have still gone the self-publishing route, or would you want to have tried your hand again at the traditional publishing path?
I think with all that I've learned, going the independent route is even better for me now than when I first started. When I first started, I didn't really think that that was something that could happen, just putting my own books out there. I thought you had to go, step A through B, get a literary agent, get, the book deal, get recognized as an author. I thought that that was pretty much all you could do, and had no idea how difficult it is to break into that industry because, you've got so many checkpoints you've got to get past, and a lot of it is subjective. Does the person who could be repping me like what I'm reading or what I'm writing today? Or maybe they could have liked it next week. Or maybe, you know, whoever they pitched the book to has to be in the right mood for whatever you're writing. And I feel like that also takes a lot of control of the business out of your hands, takes control of what you've created out of your hands. Because you can't control the timeline of when things happen. You can't necessarily control the content. You can't necessarily control what it looks like on the outside, cover creation, all that kind of thing. So I feel like if I knew what I know now, I probably wouldn't have wasted all those months or years trying to get a literary agent in the intervening time. I think I probably would have just found this community of other authors that I could, you know, swap stories with and help beta read for each other, and then find an editor that works well with me and go the independent route. Because I think that that works a lot better for me as a person.
Definitely. And just want to say, first and foremost, viewers and listeners, we're not saying that you couldn't go the but a traditional publishing route. It's whatever one's preference is. But it is important to note, if you go to like a traditional publishing house like Tor, Del Rey, Forge, just know for them it's a business. They're going to look at every letter that you send. They're going to look at your book and they really want to see, okay, is this actually going to be marketable for us? Because as I said, it is a business for them. And if your book does not sell, they will ask you to recoup the losses or the profits that they did not gain. And I also think why so many people are going the independent route is something that needs to be talked about, which is vanity publishers, which for those who don't know what that term is, vanity publishing refers to vanity publishing houses who, in exchange for large amounts of money, they promise that they will promote and distribute your work. And it takes that one experience that could deter a person away from going the traditional publishing route because of that bad experience. And not just vanity publishing, but also vanity editorial services as well. Those are all huge things that have come about, I think, more so as of recently. So as a little tangent, but an important discussion, Dana, in your opinion, how important is it for authors to really do research into, you know, the what services to look into, like for publishing houses or services? And did you ever have that interaction when you were in the midst of publishing and distributing your books?
I think it's really important for people to do a lot of research about anybody that they could be trying to sign on with. When I was trying to look for literary agents, you know, there were hours that I spent looking to see if people would be the right fit, but also using research platforms like Publishers Marketplace to see like what their reputation is. Do they, you know, follow through with their clients, that kind of thing. It's so important to know what you're getting into. I get messages from, you know, anywhere from small content creators on Instagram, you know, just getting into my DMs and saying, hey, do you want to pay me to review your book? Which is not something you can do. You can have your book removed from Amazon for that. You know, anywhere from that, to like big publishing houses that say, hey, or, you know, publishing houses, I don't know how big, but they send me emails or messages saying, hey, we publish books, why don't you come to us? In my experience, like, that kind of experience happens to people and good outcomes can happen, but most of it is not legitimate. So you have to look into it really, really well, because I've known way too many people who have been taken for a ride that way and pay that money and never get anything back.
Definitely. And I've also had friends as well who have gone through that. I had my good friend, Kim Applegren from South Africa. She was a victim of scam publishing, vanity publishing, and she sued them. And she finally got the rights to her story. but she made sure to tell Amazon to take the first edition down to get it removed. And she re-uploaded and republished the second edition, which is her true edition. And she said that that was a horrible experience she went through, but it was a learning experience to, as you said, do research, make sure you know who this person is, and if they are legitimate, whether it's a publishing house, whether it's an agent, or an editing service, always do your research. And speaking of research, knowing your audience is also very key as well. And what we mean by that is, again, for us, we write the books for ourselves. We are the first audience. We know the story better than anyone else. But to share it with others, it's important to note, okay, where does this book fall in terms of the genre category? Fantasy, sci-fi, romance, thriller, etc. So it's really important to understand the genre that it fits in, as well as the audience associated with said genre. So for you, Dana, this is a two-part question. How important is it for authors to really understand their audience, and should that be done before the author begins to write? And as a follow-up, do you have a good understanding of your audience?
I think it's really important to know who you're looking to read your book, mostly once you get to the marketing phase. I think it would have been a lot easier for me if I had had a stronger grasp on that for my first book. And hopefully I've found that kind of niche with my second. I think that finding your readership, as far as whether you should know ahead of time or not, I think it certainly would make the journey easier if you knew who you were trying to market to when you were writing it. And I know that there are lots of fantastic authors who do that. For me, it's more, this is the story that I have to tell. And then I kind of figure it out afterward once the story comes all the way out. Because I do outline quite a bit and I have a good idea of where my story is going. But sometimes that changes while you're writing. That's happened to me.
Yes.
I've had, little plot devices thrown in there and gone, oh, okay, so now I have to figure out the whole rest of my story. I think as far as my readership goes, I think if you like fantasy, if you like romance, even if it's romantasy that you like, I think that there's something in my stories for you. I think if you're looking to kind of start at the beginning of a journey with somebody and then watch the world change around them, I think that's the kind of reader that I'm looking for. People who like fantasy, people who like romantasy, people who like things like Dungeons and Dragons, because a lot of the way that my story plays out kind of plays out like if you were taking a character from, level 0 to level 20. You start with barely any skills and you kind of pick that up and hone them as you go along. I think that's probably my biggest idea on who would be a good reader. But, if you like stories like Uprooted by Naomi Novik, or the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, but you really wanted to see it told from the female point of view instead of just the male characters, then I think that is kind of where my readership lies.
Nice. And you know what? The way you just described it actually reminds you of another author I want to say a few months ago, and her story was very much based on video games, MMORPGs, and her book actually had a leveling up system. It was a book about dragons, and one of the main plot elements was throughout the story, the dragons and the writers would level up and upgrade. So by the time the book neared its climax, the character and her dragon were at like the last level you could reach in a game, because in all video games, when you reach a certain level, that's like, okay, you reach the level that you need to be to fight the boss. So from what you described, that is exactly what I imagine. And it also comes from, reading a lot of books that we've had growing up that have really inspired us to, approach stories like this, because looking at your array of books behind you, I can tell that a lot of authors have played a lot of roles in helping you come into your own as an author. Are there any authors and books you would like to name drop? And as a follow-up, and this is a long one, but it's important, how necessary, or maybe not necessary, but what are your thoughts on this where, writers are sometimes initially thought of as like liars, cheaters, and thieves because we always take everything from everyone else, we cheat people at a time, and we make stuff up. And we're always, as I said, we're always inspired by the stories we write. We don't ever want to be considered the next so-and-so because that gives people, our readers specifically, a false idea of what to expect because it could be entirely different from their expectations. You want the readers to see, oh, this is Dana Brentson. This is what I'm getting into when I pick up her stories.
As far as authors that have shaped me, I've been reading fantasy for a long time. I don't know if you know Into the Land of the Unicorns by Bruce Coville. It's from
Nope.
forever ago, very long ago. That was one of my first reads on my own, like when I was getting into chapter books, like that young. So that was one of those first fantasy stories that I thought, this is amazing. Started reading Stephen King when I was a teenager, when my parents finally let me, because some of those are terrifying. And I feel like his grasp of the craft is amazing, and the way he tells stories is amazing. So that was always inspiring to me. That kind of inspired some of my first short stories when I was in high school, that were a little bit spooky. I don't feel like I can do spooky anymore, though, so I kind of stay away from that. I feel like Outlander by Diana Gabaldon also, because she's amazing at that interpersonal story. And, she's got one of those great examples of a strong female character who plays into her strengths. It's not high fantasy or anything because, she doesn't have magic powers, but she knows what she knows and she leans into that, and she doesn't make excuses for it or apologize for it. And that was always very inspiring. And then, some like Naomi Novik, like I mentioned before, I feel like she does characters and interpersonal relationships really well. And I was devouring her Deadly Education series while I was doing revisions. So I feel like that helped me get into my character's voice better and get those interpersonal relationships to feel more real and vibrant. And then, let's see, as far as trying to figure out what you want to be. And I think that I agree with the fact that, saying that you are the next so-and-so is not necessarily the ideal, like you would think if you were not in this industry. Because there are so many ideas out there. There are so many things that people have told, and it's just about the way that you tell it. Magic is not a novel concept anymore. It's everywhere. And it's just kind of how you spin things and how you have your characters interact with them, because it can be described the same way as in Lord of the Rings, but it's going to be considered plagiarism if you're not doing it your own way. So you just got to be careful with that and find your own voice in the middle of all of these other amazing authors.
Definitely. And going back to what you said about readership, I also think that's another thing to talk about where, yes, as we said before, it is imperative to know who your audience is. But if you then fine tune it, who exactly is the target audience in terms of readership? Because I'm sure you would definitely agree, Dana, that there are some books that are geared towards an audience correctly in the sense that it's written for that audience. But then there are other books which have, in the case of like young adult, but when you pick it up, it's more new adult or adult than young adult. So it's always tricky to figure out, okay, am I writing for a young adult audience? Am I writing for a new adult audience? Or am I writing for somewhere in like the middle ground? Or as a different perspective, as like a transition, a growth. To give an example, one of my guests for this month, Eric Bowden. His story is sort of like a bridge between those who grew up with Percy Jackson and are now reading Game of Thrones. He wanted his story to be like in the center, where both ends could enjoy. But if you were on one side, you can go to the other. So for your series, where do you find yourself sort of like in the uh I guess sort of like the growth of your readership? Would you say it's like in the middle, more so towards the young adult category, or more so towards the new adult category?
I think the first book kind of bridges that gap because there's violence like you get in a lot of fantasy stories. There's descriptive language about battles, that kind of thing, but
Mm-hmm.
there aren't a lot of the more adult themes throughout. It's more of a self-discovery kind of a thing. I would still categorize it as a more adult book just because there are more adult themes. My second book definitely leans more into some darker themes. It gets a little bit more intense, I would say. And also, as far as the relationship goes between my main characters, the first book, they're kind of finding each other. So there isn't a lot of that more adult, spicy kind of content. In the second
Mm-hmm.
one, there is a little bit more because it is an adult relationship. And that, that happens. It leads to spicy things. It's also
Right.
not what the plot revolves around. So like it's there because it's still a person's story, but it's not, the typical romantic genre where you're here for the
Mm.
spice and sometimes there's some magic. So it's definitely not one of those because I love the plot and the idea of the world unfolding and figuring out what your character has to go through more so than I like, that eye-popping level of spice. That was definitely not one of my goals when I made this. So I think the
Right.
second book is definitely nestled more firmly into the adult category. The first one maybe a little bit new adult, but definitely I intended it to be an adult story.
Fascinating. And adding on to what you said about, spiciness and romance, the reason why we bring this up, viewers and listeners, is that spice romancy is probably like the most popular category right now in the publishing world. Most romance fantasy books have spiciness in their stories. And sometimes it's necessary for the plot of stories, but in other cases, it's not, and it's solely just added in there just to join in the hype train or the current trend. And that can be detrimental to a first time author because it would not be seen as their first work. And this comes down to the two paths which I like to discuss here, which is to be an author and to be known as an author. Now, you've heard me mention this numerous times on the show, but they are very important to discuss. To be an author is an individual who is dedicated to the craft of storytelling, where money is not the driving factor, but it is nice to receive capital. To be known as an author, an individual who is solely dedicated towards marketing, sharing, and promoting their stories on a multitude of different medias, whether it's billboards, commercials, interviews such as these, podcasts, and what have you. Now, not saying one is better than the other, but both have their own obstacles and trials that people really need to understand and the long-term goals in both. And one that I think both do have in common is this, is that for a first-time author, it's imperative to understand there is no guarantee in this industry that your debut book is going to be the start of your legacy as an author. Now, there are exceptions to that. Some authors have been able to live off of the success of one book while still writing more. But on the off chance that's not so much the case, and imposter syndrome comes back again with a vengeance because your goals were not met, and that may be due in part to the unrealistic goals you had in mind. So, Dana, in your opinion, how important is it for first time authors to really understand this concept that there is no guarantee that your debut work is going to be the start of your legacy, but it should not deter you from being a storyteller, from creating new works of fiction?
I think it's really important to know what you want to get out of things starting out, and also to have that expectation of, things might not go my way. And is that going to be the end of my career? For a little while, I thought that was going to happen to me. And then I realized that the story was more important than the path that I had chosen, which I think when I started out was probably to be known as an author. And I figured out through a lot of trials and tribulations for myself that what I want to do is to write my stories. And I think that if you want to be that kind of author that wants to be known, that's great. It might not happen the first time, and you just got to keep trying. If you're the kind of author who wants to get their stories out and, hope some money comes, I also think that's great. I think everybody has their own goals, and some people meet them more quickly than others. But I think one piece of advice that I've heard from a lot of other indie authors is you generally don't start to, recoup cost or start to see that you're making a living from your books until you get, 10 or 20 books on the shelf that people can pick up, until you develop that readership that knows that they like your book. And it doesn't have to be monumental and, skyrocketing success. But as long as you're writing what you want to write, and as long as you are happy doing it, I think that that's also a worthy goal, whether or not you're making a ton of money.
Definitely. And you know what? You hit the nail on the head. Like, as we said, there is no guarantee that your first book will be the start of your legacy. It may be your 10th or your 20th book. And when that happens, it be a 10th or 20th, you can tell your fans and followers who have been with you from the beginning, hey, if you enjoyed this book, you should check out my other ones and see my growth as an author. Because in the end, grit transforms into talent. That's how all authors grow. I mean, look at the books by George R. Martin, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, J.K. Rowling, Alan Smale, Vallejo Manfredi, Stephen King, um, the author of The Fourth Wing, and more. Their stories, have changed over time from the initial drafts, and it's just incredible, like how far they themselves have come as authors. There's actually one thing I remember Stephen King saying, which is like, the determination to drive. He writes 6 pages a day, which is quite like an impressive thing. Like he thinks of that as like a business.
Yeah.
And that I find, very, very impactful and inspiring. And on the topic of inspiring and sort of like this motivation, as you touched on before, Dana, your friends, your family, as well as the various authors that you've met on Book Talk and Bookstagram have like been really crucial to you in your growth as an author. Are there any particular people you want to give a shout out to for those who have really helped you grow into your own?
One of the big ones, definitely my husband, because he's been encouraging me since the beginning. And he's also a wonderful sounding board, and he has a lot of good ideas that help me to transform things. I think another person who has kind of been there from the beginning, aside from, my family beta readers, I've got my mother and father-in-law, Sherry and Paul, who have read everything that I wrote, and they're very encouraging. My parents, Tim and Holly, they're also very encouraging, and they're the ones who got me into, Stephen King and all things fantasy, and they kind of started this journey. Rihanna and Alex, who are very good beta readers. I also have a friend, beta reader, that we've swapped stories for both of our, our debut and our follow-up. Her name's Trinity Cunningham. She's been very helpful. She has really good constructive criticism on those first rough drafts that have helped me shape things. And I've been really fortunate to read some of her stuff as well. I also have a friend who kind of crosses that personal / bookstagram model named Jesse Dean, who just had a book come out. He kind of does some fantasy stuff that he's got posted through Amazon, and then he just tipped his hat into cowboy romance. And he is very good at networking and talking to people, and he gives me a lot of inspiration for kind of stepping out of my shell, because I am not the person who likes to network and talk to people. So it's fun to see that, and it's nice to see how encouraging a lot of different authors are. And I've really enjoyed connecting with a few of them.
Nice. And you know what? It is really true. Networking is important. As one person said, or as the famous saying goes, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And
Mhm.
sometimes, someone may have a trick that will help us get the golden goose that can help us grow and grow exponentially in our careers, as well as supporting each other, which is also key. I know people think that in the publishing world, it's a very cutthroat mentality, and maybe some parts of that are true, depending on the individual. But 9 times out of 10, I think you would definitely agree, Dana, that especially in the independent industry, we all want to be there for one another because we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to promote each other's work. It's not easy, and sometimes we are each other's cheerleader. And from these individuals, we learn so much from them, who give us, words of wisdom to help us grow. Which now leads us to the final question of this interview. And funnily enough, it goes back to what I just said not too long ago. So, with everything that you've learned from your friends, family, fellow authors, beta and ARC readers, the journey thus far, and everything you've learned about being an author thus far, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors out there watching this or listening to this for the first time and wanting to get a head start on their own journey?
I think you gotta just keep writing what you love, keep writing something that you don't love, go back and revise it, figure out ways to make it better so that it resonates with you first and foremost. I think that the readers that love it will find it. And it's also it's going to be hard, and it's going to be worth it. And I think that everybody who wants to pursue this should just go for it, because the worst that can happen is that it doesn't go very far. But what if the next one does? What if the one after that is the one that goes far enough that you can start sustaining this on its own?
That is beautifully said and eloquently put, Nana, and a perfect ending to this incredible author interview. Thank you all so much for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. Again, a huge thank you to today's guest, Dana Brentson, for coming on the show. Dana, where can people find and engage with you on social media? And where can people buy your books?
On social media, I'm most active on Instagram, DC Brentson Author. And I do a little bit on Book Talk, a little bit on Twitter. And then as far as my books go, you can find them on Amazon, and you can also find them on my website, dcbrentson.com.
I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Make sure to give her a follow on social media, and make sure to check out her stories. Which, before I forget, Dina, are there any other projects we can expect from you down the road as a little teaser?
I am currently working on book 3 in the series, and I'm also working on kind of a standalone in the same world, but a different cast of characters at kind of concurrent times as the books that I'm writing right now.
Awesome. So you heard it first, viewers and listeners. More books by Dana are in the works. So make sure to follow her on social media and check out her two books 1 and book 2, out on her page to buy them. So again, thank you all so very much for joining us for another author interview. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful afternoon.